Hey everyone, Ashton here, and welcome back to Precision Horology. Up today, we have something very special and something of a personal favorite of mine to work on. We have the dash-mounted timers by Heuer. On the left, we can see we have the Heuer Master Time 8-day clock, and on the right, we can see we have the Monte Carlo 12-hour timer. Now, our clock on the left tells time as it would any particular clock in a car, and our timer on the right is a 12-hour timer. We have our minutes indicated on the outside track with this hand, we have our seconds indicated, and we have our hours indicated in this aperture here. We can start, stop, and reset the timer with the use of our buttons. Now on the left we have what's known as the Heuer Late Master Time. Now this dates to around 1968, with earlier models looking slightly different, having only the 12, 3, 6, and 9 numbers, with a different outside minute track, and we also have triangle indices down at the 6. Then we have the even earlier versions with the Heuer dials, and the earlier version with the Heuer dial. Now this particular dash timer will be installed into a 1968 Lotus Europa. On the Monte Carlo timer, we will be adding a decimal indexed bezel, which has been supplied, and we'll be installing new crystals into the watch as well. Well, when tackling a job like this, it's easy for one to become overwhelmed with the amount of work that has to be done. But we will tackle it the same way we would if we were to eat an elephant, and that is one bite at a time. Now, first we're going to start with the 8-day Heuer Master Time clock, and then we'll move on to the Monte Carlo 12-hour timer. So at this point, we've removed our 8-day clock from the mounting plate that will be installed onto the dash of the vehicle, and we are ready to disassemble. Now, it's interesting to note that we have a tritium dial from the 1960s, so we aren't dealing with the effects of radium, so we don't need to be extra cautious when it comes to a radioactive dial. We can be relatively safe knowing that the dial is tritium. So here we have, ticking away inside our Heuer Master Timer, is a Heuer Leonidas marked 8-day movement. Now, this movement is a movement which is based on the, I believe it's pronounced Arogno, I'm not really sure, I believe it's a Swiss-French word, Arogno, not really sure how to say it, my French accent isn't so good, the Arogno 28 movement, and it is a single barrel 8-day power reserve movement. Previous versions featured a review Tomin double barrel movement, but in the early 1960s, the single barrel movement was moved to, and that's the movement that you see here today. We can see that it's a relatively stock standard manual wind movement, which has a hacking setting or hacking feature, also called a balance stop spring. If we look in this section, when I pull the crown out, we will see the engagement of that hacking lever or balance stop spring. It pivots out and acts against the screws of our balance, and when the crown is pushed back in, it allows the watch to once again tick. Pull out, our balance is stopped, push in, and once again the watch is able to tick. So it's at this point we should have a look at our preliminary timing results of the movement. So the first thing you'll notice now that the watch is on the timing machine is that we have the watch in the pendant up position. Now we have to remember that we're dealing with a clock here, we're not actually dealing with a watch. This is going to be mounted on the dash of a vehicle, so it's only going to be in one position. So we would regulate it for this position because the watch or the clock doesn't really deal with positional error like a traditional watch would. Now you'll notice that our timing results don't seem to be displayed on our timing machine. If we look at our signal here, we'll notice that we have a very erratic signal. And in fact, if we turn our speaker on, we can listen to the watch. Can you hear that the watch almost sounds like it's galloping? This watch isn't running well, and because of that, or this clock I should say, because of that we aren't able to see any preliminary timing results of the movement. Well, we've now successfully uncased the watch, or the clock. We've removed the dial and hands, and we're ready to begin assembly. We're ready to begin disassembly and inspection of components. But before we do that, we're going to have a look at a couple of features that this watch possesses. Now, we can see, if we look down here, a hole in the movement. Now that is where our dial foot sits. Now if you watched the video discussing the part 1 of the Patek Philippe backwind, you'll know that that possessed a very interesting way of securing the dial to the movement. And I mentioned screws that have a cutout, I mentioned a semicircular cutout, and then are unscrewed to hold the dial in place. Well, that is the example that we have here. We don't have screws that come in from the side to hold the movement in place. We have a screw on the movement that we would then unscrew. We would keep the flat part like it is. We would push the dial foot through, and we'd unscrew or turn that screw anti-clockwise so that it bites in to the dial feet. We also have quite an interesting regulating unit on the watch. If we look here, we see this large notched wheel here. If we actually move this wheel like so, we can regulate our watch, because this wheel is directly connected to our curb pins, which are shortening or lengthening the active length of our balance spring so that the watch can keep time. Our dial is relatively standard, pretty simple mini small clock or large watch dial, but what I found on the back of the dial was quite interesting. If we turn the dial over, we can see pooling of grease on the outside here. Quite a bit of grease. Now thankfully, that oil and that grease has not made its way onto the dial itself, but we can clearly see that this watch has, this clock has been taken an oil bath at some point, and that's something that we definitely need to address and make sure that we don't over oil when the watch is lubricated next. Now this isn't really interesting, but it's just cool. That is quite the winding crown. I think that puts modern Breitling winding crowns to shame. Perhaps it is even larger than the winding crown of a modern Graham. So it's at this point that we put the crown and winding stem back in the watch, and we release the power, and we can get to work on dismantling the watch, fault finding, and addressing any areas of concern. I've already seen that we're going to need to do a little bit of balance spring work because it appears to be out of flat, and I imagine there's going to be some pivot polishing to do as we're not very sure of the service history of this watch. So stay tuned for part 2 of the Heuer Master Time 8-day dash-mounted clock. The rally timer will be taken care of in a separate set of videos, so stay tuned for that as well. Well, thanks for joining me today. Don't forget to subscribe so that you can be notified about when the next video is released, and feel free to please leave a comment and share this video with your friends. So thanks again, and see you next time.